Welcome to FO Podcasts. With me is William McChesney. We are recording this on August 11th, and the Washington Post has a headline, the top headline on its printed paper, about Syrian bloodshed not ending. And our topic today, what we are discussing today is why are Syrian refugees not returning home? Welcome, William.
Glad to be here. Thank you for having me, Atul.
All right, William, why are so many Syrians refugees in so many countries?
To answer that question, we go back all the way to 2011, when the government of Bashar al-Assad came under pressure from various protests related to the Arab Spring.
The Arab uprisings, as I like to call it, because it didn't happen during spring.
Very true. And what came about as a result of a very heavy-handed and violent response from the government of Syria was 14 years of civil war, which has pushed 13 million people into internal displacement and 6 million Syrians into refugee status in the abroad. The primary host countries of those refugees are Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. So that is a little bit of the background as to what happened and why they came to be so many Syrian refugees.
Now, you mentioned that 13 million are internally displaced.
Yes.
And the population of Syria is 24 million. Is that correct?
25 million.
24,
yes.
25. So you're basically saying more than 50% of Syrians in the country,
correct,
are, if not exactly refugees, have had to leave their homes.
Have had to completely rebuild their livelihoods at any rate, yes.
Got it. So this has been going on since 2011, as you point out. And before that, you had a very repressive regime, particularly under Father Hafez al-Assad. We know about the various massacres. Why is it that people didn't escape Syria then? Why is it that after 2011 they started leaving in such large numbers? Is it because different ethnicities turned on each other, neighbor turned on neighbor? Was it just the scale of violence, both by the state and indeed, you can argue, by radical groups like the Islamic State? Did that go off the charts?
Certainly that's part of it. I mean, the scale of violence perpetrated by the Syrian government under Bashar al-Assad was extreme, more extreme than anything that had been seen in the country up to that point. As al-Assad and his government lost control of various regions of the country, that power vacuum was filled by a number of groups willing and able to perpetrate extraordinary violence. And a lot of that violence took on a sectarian character where religious and ethnic minorities were targeted. So different regions that had very complicated dynamics suddenly became incredibly hostile to their own denizens. And in a very short period of time, you had a situation that was undesirable, but maybe still bearable for the people who lived there, into something that was unacceptable and something to flee at all costs.
Got it. So the situation worsened, arguably, from the time of Hafez al-Assad.
Absolutely. The economy ground down. The government and the ruling family became less and less popular. As economic opportunities or lack thereof sort of impacted the different regions of Syria, there were sort of internal migrations that exacerbated regional and sectarian tensions. So there was a lot of pressure building in a lot of ways that became untenable once the government of Syria came under this political pressure from the protest movement.
All right, so we have a new government in power since December.
Yes.
They took charge in December. Hafez al-Assad's son, Bashar al-Assad, who began life as a doctor, if I remember, an ophthalmologist. He's now in Moscow. Now we have a new guy in charge, who's a former al-Qaeda member.
Correct.
So tell us about this new government. Tell us about this new Syrian leader.
Well, the new leader, Ahmed al-Sharaa, is, as you said, a former militiaman from al-Qaeda in Iraq. He joined that group 3 years after the American invasion of Iraq to fight in the insurgency there. He has had some affiliation with other al-Qaeda related groups in Syria. He has briefly been involved with the Islamic State. Several years ago, he merged his group, the al-Nusra Front, which was a radical Islamist militia, with a number of other similar groups to form Hayat Tahrir Hasham, which is the HTS, if you've heard of them, is sort of the dominant.
Almost like HKS, Harvard Kennedy School. HKS. Just one letter separates them.
I think you'd meet a very different student body in those two groups.
Yeah.
But HTS, by 2020, 2021, became the dominant rebel group operating in northwest Syria, particularly in the Idlib province.
Yeah. Next to Turkey.
Yes. And they made strong inroads with the Turkish government. They had good contacts with the Turkish government, and the Turkish government was willing to use them, at least in the short term, to achieve its ends.
Now, let's talk about Ahmed al-Sharaa a little bit. He is also known as Abu al-Jolani.
Yes.
So Jolani is the Arab word for the Golan Heights.
Correct.
And so his family, his father originally is from the Golan.
Mm-hmm.
And he grew up, correct me if I'm getting my facts wrong, he grew up in Saudi Arabia, did he?
He was born there and spent a significant portion of his childhood there, yes.
Excellent. So give us a little bit of color as to what kind of family he comes from, what sort of a chap is he, and how has he graduated from battle fatigues to a suit and cavorting with Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell now, and the dynamic duo who run The Rest is Politics.
I unfortunately have limited information on his formative years or how they impacted his current worldview. But maybe the best place to start is roughly 2022, 2023. I think amidst realization that the war in Syria had reached something of a deadlock, al-Sharaa, or al-Jolani, as you said, is the nom de guerre that he has used frequently, began to rebrand himself as much more of a moderate and pragmatic figure, and began forging short-term alliances between HTS and some other groups in Syria who normally would not have been amenable to HTS's interests. By December of last year, the al-Assad government, just after years of repression and internal corruption that hollowed out the security apparatus, collapsed rather spectacularly, and al-Sharaa was able to take power with minimal opposition, really.
I'm told by a number of friends in the intelligence world that the social base of the Assad regime had been narrowing for years, and eventually that base was a little too pinpointed for the regime to continue in power.
It's really a case study in sort of dictatorships have to stay in power by drawing support from as many people as they can and delivering benefits to as few people as they can, because benefits are scarce resources, and if you don't have quite so many of them to go around, then it's hard to keep people on side. So between
I think
20,
that holds true. That holds true sometimes, uh, even for not just dictatorships, for monarchies, for one-party states, all authoritarian
I think
regimes.
any situation where you have centralized power, this is sort of the economics of authoritarianism. You
Yeah.
have to make people who are under you but powerful feel that they are replaceable, and you have to make the very weak feel like they have someone looking out for them.
Mm, yeah.
Um,
So
and
yeah. So basically, what you're saying is that the authoritarians, even in Syria, have to deliver some social services.
they do.
There is an implicit, if not an explicit, social contract, and when they fail to deliver on that implicit social contract, particularly for a protracted period of time, eventually collapse follows.
Agreed. And also, if you we have to talk about corruption if we're talking about the al-Assad government. Um, when you lose the means to reward the elites who support you, that also violates the contract of power. And that is very much what began to happen to the al-Assad regime by December of last year. There was simply no way for the al-Assad government to keep its people happy or to reward the various elites who controlled the security apparatus.
Understood. By this time, they have been in power 54 years after Papa Assad took charge. And my question to you is you referred to Turkey, and you said that Turkey backed HTS, Ahmed al-Sharaa, or Abu al-Jolani, whatever you want to call him, and they did so for their strategic reasons. So, what are Turkey's reasons for backing Ahmed al-Sharaa?
First of all, it's a great way to extend power without their need to get directly involved.
Hmm.
It is a good way to put pressure on the various Kurdish groups active, especially in northeastern Syria.
Mm.
It is kind of a sign of Turkey's power that they have put their support behind someone who is now in charge. Turkey very much wants to be seen as sort of the deal maker, the resolver of intractable conflicts in its immediate backyard. And we saw that also in the role that Turkey played in supporting Azerbaijan in its campaign against Armenia in 2020 and again last year.
So some people are saying this is the collapse of Sykes-Picot, which of course we know was over 100 years ago, and a new world came into being in the Middle East thanks to Mr. Sykes and Monsieur Picot divvying up the Middle East, divvying up the Ottoman Empire between themselves. And now the neo Ottomans are back. Would that be uh, too tall a claim?
Not necessarily. I feel sometimes that the grandiosity of the rhetoric overshadows just how pragmatic and piecemeal and tactical that approach has been under Tayyip Erdogan.
Recep Tayyip Erdogan, as you. Good. So we have Turks now, the Sunnis actually. Let's not beat around the bush. The Alawites were a minority Shiite sect. They were persecuted as far back as 1520 by Selim I.
Hmm.
The French patronized them because, of course, they were a minority and they owed their patronage and protection to the French, and they eventually took over the state after the French left. And now you have the Sunnis back in charge in Damascus. And you have MIT, not the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Boston, in Cambridge rather, uh, but MIT, the Turkish secret service, backing al-Sharaa or Jolani, and you have Mossad on the other side, which has taken the Golan Heights and a little bit of Druze territory further north.
And it should be noted, has advanced their position in the Golan Heights as well.
Well, they've taken Golan completely, and they destroyed the entire Syrian Air Force in a single day.
Yep.
So now you have, instead of Sykes-Picot, you have MIT and Mossad, bish bash bosh.
I mean, you have two countries that have two wildly different views of the Middle East, who are both very powerful in their own backyard, seeking to address what they see as sort of a regional order that either has outlived its usefulness or was deeply unjust to begin with. That latter view being more the Turkish point of view. As we were alluding to this earlier, sort of the end of Sykes-Picot. I think the Turkish worldview that's very much on display here is that there was a certain order imposed by the European notion of border making that was better mitigated under the auspices of the Ottoman Empire, and that system of regional governance was superior for the region.
Yeah, I still meet Turks who hold that point of view, who argue incessantly that Aleppo, which lies on the road to Istanbul, or Constantinople as it was known until recently, was run by its notables, les notables, and so was Damascus, and the centralized nation state the French created with its centralized bureaucracy was ill-suited to the warp and woof of the social fabric, the tapestry of the Middle East, and using the local notables to run different cities and regions was arguably more in keeping with the culture of the region and was more democratic than what the French or the British left behind.
Absolutely. And I think something that's come across in the interactions I've had in Turkey is the belief that any border that you draw in the Middle East, particularly the ones drawn by the Europeans, is going to be done with the most disregard for local cultures and customs, particularly regions that are shared by multiple cultures or ethnicities or tribal identities. Something that comes across very clearly in the rhetoric put out by the Turkish government is that we are in the best position to resolve disputes that were artificially created, and it can be solved by doing it our way.
Brilliant. So that is the Turkish position, and the Turks now back the new government. But let's be honest, the new government has been unable to contain the violence in Syria. So you've told us about the brutality of the Assad regime. Walk us through the violence since December.
Since the government took power, the provisional government under al-Sharaa took power, there have been attempts to assert control over the entire country. Perhaps with the exception of Golan, because the al-Sharaa government cannot risk a confrontation with Israel. More on that later. But in March and April, we saw a very clumsy attempt by the government to enter Latakia. Government forces didn't have the strength to do this on their own and turned to other groups under their sort of Turkish affiliated tent, such as the Syrian National Army, to enter the region. And almost immediately it became a bloodbath. Soldiers and militiamen were knocking on doors in Latakia, asking residents their religious affiliation.
And this is, just so that our listeners know, this is Alawite territory.
Yes.
These are the hills by the coast. The Russians have a base there.
This is
They have a naval base in Tartus.
They do, and an air base in Hmeimim.
So this is, remember, the Assad regime was allied to the Soviet Union, and the Alawites have protectors now in the form of Russians and government troops and their allies were going into the hills, which is Alawite territory, which is extraordinarily uh, fertile guerrilla territory because of the hills and the coasts.
The hills and the coast, and historically, its geographic and social distinction from the rest of Syria. We're talking about a region that identifies and presents itself very differently from the rest of Syria.
And remember, this is where the Alawites fled when they were persecuted by Ottomans back during the period of Sunni rule multiple times. And this is where you have a stronghold of the Alawites. So this is where government troops go and they start asking people, tell me if you're a Shia or a Sunni, a Alawite or whatever. And the killings begin. Is that correct? Would that be fair
Correct.
to say?
Based on how people answered, they were executed
So
summarily.
it's ethnic violence.
It is very much so, and it was an incredibly incendiary thing for government forces to do, to go to Latakia in the first place. And by relying on outside help from irregular militias, uh, this was almost guaranteed to cause violence. Um, the amount of violence that it caused in a very short amount of time, I think, has given pause to a lot of people who thought that perhaps Syria was now on the road to recovery with the ouster of the al-Assad government and the new provisional government.
Okay, but that's not the only violence. We have been reading about druze. We've been reading about the Bedouin tribes as well, right? So
Yes,
walk us through um, a rough timeline, not a blow by blow account, not a date by date account, but broadly the contours of this violence.
broadly speaking, you had unrest between the Bedouin groups and the Druze groups in the Sueda area of Syria. That escalated into violence roughly a month and a half, 2 months ago. The Syrian government responded with what they called a peacekeeping operation. The forces were sent with the aim of securing a ceasefire between Druze communities and Bedouin communities. However, it has been alleged that those peacekeeping forces intervened on the side of Bedouin militiamen and perpetrated massacres against Druze civilians in Sueda. So once again, we're seeing the inflammation of ethnic tensions
Mm.
by a government that has vowed to its international backers that it could mitigate that violence, that it could bring a stop to ethnic tensions and regional tensions in Syria.
William, the Israelis struck the defense ministry as well. So Israel got involved on the side of the Druze.
Yes, the Druze in Israel have been strategic partners of the Israeli government. The Druze communities elsewhere are minorities in all of the countries they are in. While the Druze community in Syria did denounce the attacks and announce its support for Syria against Israel, there are fears now that the Israeli intervention is once again going to exacerbate sentiment against the Druze community in Syria.
Understood. So, is this ethnic violence the reason why people are not returning?
It is certainly part of it, and I think if you look at the demographics of who fled Syria when they fled, we see a greater than average amount of flight by ethnic and tribal minorities in Syria to neighboring countries. The recent violence has shown that the al-Sharaa government has not been able to mitigate that violence, and that if they were considering returning, it is still much too fraught for them to do so. However, there are other causes, some of them recent and some of them much more long-standing.
So, walk us through those causes, both recent and long standing.
Well, the first one is much more related to the expansion and escalation of Israel's conflict with groups in the area such as Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in South Lebanon. There is no sign of that conflict abating, and as of this morning, the Israeli government announced a renewal of its campaign to seize the majority of Gaza, including Gaza City. Why does that affect Syria? Because last year in October and November, strikes were carried out against pro-Iran targets in Lebanon, but also on the Lebanon's border with Syria. All 5 major crossings where Syrian refugees in Lebanon could feasibly have returned to Syria have been damaged beyond the point of usability. Without a sign that that campaign is going to abate, and with Israel having carried out strikes on Damascus directly, it becomes much more difficult for people to return to Syria if they think there's going to be greater conflict, more escalation, more of an Israeli presence, because as we mentioned earlier, they now control almost all of the Golan Heights.
So Israeli actions contribute to this climate of fear.
Mm-hmm. Another exacerbating factor is the dismantling of U.S. aid and U.S. sponsored international aid under the Trump administration. That has strongly negative effect for refugee support in the countries that Syrian refugees have fled to, but it has a much greater impact on Syrian refugees who are still in Syria and communities in Syria that relied on international aid for recovery. So people who may have been considering returning to Syria, thinking that there might be some international support in the communities that they fled from, communities that have been devastated by the war, are being further disincentivized to return home.
They do not know who will feed them should they show up
No. And
in their
while,
village.
exactly. And that, of course, brings into question sort of if they were to return to Syria, could they return to the specific part of Syria from which they came? Um, some regions, of course, have been practically annihilated, and it's not feasible to expect someone to return to what is effectively rubble.
Yeah. Now, one of the things, speaking of rubble, one of the things that many people, including people in MI6 and CIA and Mossad, talk about is how the drought um, before 2011 triggered the Arab uprisings in Syria
Hmm.
because a lot of people had to leave their parched land. They moved to cities. Suddenly you had tensions. The cake was shrinking, and there were too many people wanting a slice of a shrinking cake. And then eventually, of course, communities turned on each other. They
Hmm.
protested against the Assad regime because revolutions depend on the price of bread, and then they turned on each other. Do you have sympathy with this argument?
I do to a limited degree, and I think the how much should be blamed on the drought, I'm unsure of. But what is true is that as economic opportunity in the more rural parts of Syria began to decline, there was a large movement of people towards Syria's urban centers, which has a tendency, like any mass movement of people, there is a tendency to be fearful and hostile towards outsiders who are coming in, particularly if economic conditions were not great to begin with, and all of a sudden you have outsiders competing for the same kinds of opportunities that you need. So, whether or not this should be blamed directly on the drought entirely, I'm not sure it's a 100% explanation for what happened, but
It's a contributory factor, basically.
absolutely,
Got it.
absolutely. In that it greatly disrupted what had been the demographics and the economic um, environment that was in Syria.
So you've talked about Israel. We've mentioned the drought before that. We've talked about the dismantling of US aid and international organizations dispensing aid. These are the proximate factors. What are the other long standing factors inhibiting return of refugees back to their homes?
Well, the primary one is, of course, that there is simply no economic opportunity in Syria at this time.
Mm.
GDP is practically non-existent. There are no jobs. Um, Confidence that the government can reinstate the necessary infrastructure for the economy to grow, be that electricity, running water, what have you, is very, very low. So while the conditions that refugees are experiencing in the countries they've gone to may not be ideal, and in fact, um, they can be, in fact, extremely limited and squalid, as it were. A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. The present situation for them economically is, at the very least, a sure thing for the next month, 2 months.
Understood. So, as refugees, they may be living in squalor, but at least they can eat something. And if they return to what is, in effect, a chaotic war zone,
Mhm.
they do not know if they will be getting their daily bread.
Exactly. On top of that, as I hope we've made clear, the perception is that the violence in Syria could get much, much worse,
Hmm.
that the control that the al-Sharaa government has would decline even further. So there's every risk that if you, a Syrian refugee, were to return, it would not be very long before you got forced out all over again. With the added complication that a lot of neighboring countries that have taken in Syrian refugees have barred them from re-entry if they should leave. So they're effectively trapped. If whenever they leave and wherever they leave to, they will not be able to go back to their host countries. And these are, in some cases, countries they've lived in for 8 years, 10 years, 12 years since the very beginning of the conflict.
And you gave an example in our conversation before this podcast. Let's say you are a Syrian family that fled the persecution of the Assad regime. You're now living in Turkey. You, of course, speak Arabic and you can read and write Arabic, academic Arabic, professional Arabic, but your children have gone to Turkish schools and they cannot do so. They can speak Arabic to you and demand hummus or or whatever the local village dish happens to be. But if they were to go back to Syria, then they don't even have the language to operate
Yes.
professionally in Syria.
Yes, I remember reading a story about a woman in Turkey who left very early in the conflict with her three grammar school aged children who are now finishing up high school. In that time, they speak dialectal Syrian Arabic at home, and they speak Turkish at school or with their friends or at their jobs. But they're not able to speak formal Arabic at all. So, were they to go back to Syria, they would immediately be in the bottom of their class in any Syrian high school. Um, Additionally, it's unclear if you, a Syrian high schooler who's been in high school in Turkey, it's unclear whether your degree will count for Syrian universities or other universities for that matter.
Got it. And so you're already set in your location, whether it is Jordan, whether it is Turkey, whether it is Lebanon, um, and your country, your home is now a war zone with threat of ethnic cleansing, if not ethnic cleansing, certainly ethnic violence. The economy is in the toilet, in the gutter. There are no jobs. Um, your children speak another language, and the qualifications you may have do not count. So, what sounds to me is that just as many Americans came to America, ages ago, and still do. And this is the story of an older friend's grandmother who came from Italy, hated America, missed the food, missed her family, missed Mass in church, hated the churches here because they didn't have the architecture, hated the music as well because the organ wasn't good enough. And yet she died in America because her 8 or 9 children, in those days, Catholic Italians used to have many more children than today. And out of the demographic crisis that you see in Southern Europe today, the 8 or 9 children she had were all American, spoke Italian in which they could talk about food, but it was childish Italian. And they didn't want to go back to Italy anyway. Italy was poorer. So she stayed on in America, ended up dying in America, and her children and her grandchildren, of course, are completely American. So the point you're making is that just as immigrants who didn't like America couldn't return, many of them, many of the immigrants who may not like Jordan, who may not like Turkey, who may not like Lebanon, who may not like Germany or any other place they happen to be, cannot return because they have children there and their lives are there.
I think the comparison is apt, and you know, it's just worth repeating that this, for some people, this is a situation that's lasted more than a decade. The circumstances under which refugees might be living in countries other than Syria is not ideal, but people have come to establish livelihoods. They're getting married to people that they've met in the countries they fled to. Their families back in Syria are either being pushed into exile themselves or they're dying off. So there may be less and less reason to go back to Syria for family reasons at all. Um, it's you, to to keep going with the theme of children here. Um, it's hard enough to move yourself if you're also moving your wife and or your spouse and your children. It becomes a very expensive and logistically complicated thing to undertake that's just not worth it if for the better part of 15 years you've been living somewhere else and slowly but surely putting down some sort of roots there.
So we've talked about logistics becoming very difficult. Give us a snapshot of what's the big challenge, logistical challenge of moving back.
Well, it's worth mentioning that refugees, at least who are in camps, which many of them are, certainly in Turkey or Jordan or Lebanon, is something of a poverty trap. You have to pay for the upkeep of whatever hovel you're living in. That greatly restricts the amount of capital that Syrian refugees can save up to undertake the trip back to Syria. That's being made more complicated. Certain countries are imposing fees at the borders. Depending on how many family members you would be trying to make the crossing with, it can cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $600 or more, which is a phenomenal amount of money for a family of Syrian refugees. Moreover,
$600 for the entire family or per head?
for the entire family.
Got it.
But this would be a family which perhaps has only one breadwinner.
Mm.
And as I said, it's exceptionally difficult to save up any money, especially in countries that are really only allowing Syrians to perform menial labor. Logistically, depending on where you make the crossing, where in Syria you arrive to, it's extraordinarily complicated, in some cases impossible to reach certain parts of Syria. So you could perhaps go back, but maybe have to start your life anew in a completely unknown part of the country.
So you've mentioned certain countries are only allowing Syrians to do menial work. Um, from the sounds of it, Jordan doesn't have too many jobs. Turkey has an unemployment crisis. Are Syrian refugees facing a pushback? Because we know from various countries around the world, you go to South Africa, there's a pushback against immigrants. Of course, the European pushback is well documented. Uh, but even Pakistan, which supported the Taliban and is run by a military dictatorship, really, de facto, not de jure, is seeing a pushback against Afghan refugees. So, or migrants, as some people would call them. I mean, in the case of Pakistan, a lot of these Afghans were actually refugees because of the endemic cycle of violence that has lasted in Afghanistan for decades.
Mm-hmm.
Um, are Syrians facing this a similar problem? I shouldn't say the same problem, but a similar problem.
Very much so. I think enough ink has been spilled about the very racist trends on social media, on Turkish social media, against Syrian refugees. A refrain that might sound familiar to some, that uh, Syrians have come to take our jobs. That's a soundbite that has been exploited, certainly by nationalist politicians in Lebanon, who have sought to shift the blame for economic woes in their country onto Syrian refugees. That as economic opportunity is in decline, the large amount of Syrians who are here are to blame. And for us to recover, it's imperative that we get them to go back to Syria.
Okay, so that is, if there's a pull factor that refugees have a safer life in these host countries, there's a push factor, at least, even though it may not be as strong as the pull factor of discrimination that may at least make them think of going back.
Certainly. None of the three countries that we've been discussing in earnest, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, are signatories to the UN's 1951 Convention on Refugees and their Rights, which means the actual status of refugees in these countries is a bit of a gray area and certainly nowhere near on par with the citizens of those countries. That even if Syrian refugees have some sort of formal status, which, speaking at least just for Turkey, only 17% of Syrians there have any kind of official status. The rest live off the grid to some degree.
So 17 out of 100 people have, or 17 out of 100 Syrian refugees in Turkey have legal status.
Mm-hmm.
83, you were telling me, are living off the grid.
Correct.
So there must be a huge parallel economy in Turkey. There must be a completely um, different world or underworld in which these people operated.
Exactly. And there have been criminal activities that prey on Syrians and take advantage of the fact that they cannot go to the authorities for help.
I see. So we've discussed a lot, we've covered a lot of grounds from geopolitics to ethnic um, conflict, sectarian violence. Um, and we have gone quite comprehensively into the many reasons why refugees are not returning. Of course, comprehensive by podcast standards. This is not an academic paper, ladies and gentlemen. My final question to you, William, is what happens now?
I think, unfortunately, what happens now is more of the same. Um, there does not seem to be a solution to address the three new factors that we've talked about that are compelling Syrians to stay where they are. There's no sign of de-escalation of the Israeli campaign. There is no sign that U.S. support for international aid is to come back anytime soon. And it certainly does not appear that the al-Sharaa government has a policy prescription for the renewed ethnic violence in
Does it
Latakia and
even
Suabia.
does it even have the ability to enforce its writ in the country, or are we seeing what many are calling the cantonization of Syria, basically the de facto unraveling of Syria?
I think so. We're aside from just the violent conflict, we're also seeing moves by al-Sharaa himself to secure favorable appointments for his own people. The selection of the new Syrian parliament, roughly half of the sitting parliamentarians were directly appointed. That makes people think that we are just returning to another version of Syria, not dissimilar from the al-Assad version of Syria, where governance is achieved by sort of elite bargaining and bringing together a coalition of paternalistic actors. So there's really no room for anything to improve when effectively the country is broken up into sort of feudal principalities.
Excellent or not so excellent, as we are learning from you, William. Um, so, what you seem to suggest is that Syria will gradually break up into its constituent parts along ethnic lines. The refugees are not going to return because they have their lives elsewhere. They will gradually um, assimilate, or maybe at least, if not assimilate, they will gradually, yeah, meld into the societies where they are living. And the refugee crisis in Syria will continue because of the ethnic conflict. More of the same means that we began by saying that 6 million Syrians are refugees outside Syria. 13 out of 24/25 million are internally displaced. And it seems the numbers of the displaced and the numbers of the refugees could go up.
Absolutely. And I think as the government fails to rebuild infrastructure, we'll see displacement of the displaced, as it were, that the ability for people to survive at all in different parts of Syria will degrade even further.
All right. Not a very cheery podcast, but it's important to shine the light on Syria. William is a, a, a scholar of the region. He speaks Arabic. He's also lived actually in Russia and speaks Russian as well. His wife is Russian. So
It's a
we'll
good way to
have
learn the language.
exactly. La Diccionaria de pelo largo, as the Spanish say, the dictionary of the long hair. So, but William, we'll have you back to talk about many things. Thank you so much for your time. And here's hoping against hope that things in Syria do get better.
Thank you so much for having me. And yes, let's all spare a thought for the people impacted by the issues we've discussed.
From Atul Singh, it is bye for now. Follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you're listening to this podcast. Make sure you sign up for our newsletter. Go to www.fairobserver.com and sign up, actually, not just for our newsletter. We have more than one newsletter. Sign up for our newsletters. From Washington, D.C., from the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., a stone's throw from the US Treasury, and a stone's throw or a throw and a half from the White House. It is bye for now.